Imperial Yeast has been up to some interesting things lately, and they recently announced a product we are super excited about. If you're familiar with Imperial Yeast, you're likely aware of their classification system. A is for ale as an A07 flagship, L is for lager as an L17 harvest, and so on. Well, they recently released the first strain in their I series, which stands for Imperialis and refers to non-GMO hybrids or derivative yeast strains developed by Imperial Yeast that have been honed to exhibit the traits today's brewers most desire. The initial offering, I-22 Capri, is a hybrid of A38 Juice and A43 Loki, two of Imperial's most popular strains for hop-forward IPA. Whether you're into this style or just enjoy juicier fermentation characteristics, you have got to try I-22 Capri. Learn more about the Imperialis project and I-22 Capri at imperialyeast.com. Fermentation is the very cool process where yeast consumes sugar, then produce alcohol and CO2 as byproducts. When it comes to beer, the most common source of these fermentable sugars is malted barley, but it's certainly not the only source. You are listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and on this episode, I'm joined by contributor Will Lovell to discuss not only the use of honey when brewing in general, but more specifically, the point at which it gets added.
So honey is a really awesome ingredient that has a long tradition in fermentation, and while it's not so long in the use of beer, it has come to be quite a popular thing to add, and some would say it's the bee's knees in brewing.
Oh, Lord. Well, of all of the adjunct fermentables brewers use to make beer, I would have to say that honey is probably the most popular, even more so than, plain sugar, which I guess arguably is used more commonly these days than it used to be. But, even when I started brewing over 20 years ago, people were using honey to contribute unique characteristics to their beer. And I'd have to say that blonde ale was probably the most common, or is the most common style that people are using honey in these days. As is the case with pretty much everything in brewing, there are some pretty strong opinions as to when the honey should be added during the brewing process, which is exactly what we're going to be focusing on today. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you want us to keep doing it, consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with somebody in the brewing world. Our guest for this month, September of 2023, is someone we all know and love, a name I trust all of our listeners will recognize, the one and only John Palmer. From writing How to Brew to co-hosting the awesome Brew Strong podcast on the Brewing Network, John has left an unquestionable impression on the hobby of homebrewing, and we are excited that he agreed to come back to kick it with our patrons for a second time. To be a part of this session, all you have to do is make a pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy no later than Friday, September 29th, 2023, as John's going to be taking questions that Saturday, the 30th. All past sessions are available on our private Patreon and Facebook pages, so you can go back and watch them whenever you like. Learn more about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy. And if you wouldn't mind using the links found at brewlosophy.com/support when you're shopping online, we'd really appreciate that as well. All you have to do is click a link, do your shopping. Your experience feels exactly the same, and we get a little kickback. It's very little that helps us to keep producing this show. Thanks so much to everyone who's already taken the time to do that. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who are known for their incredible all-in-one electric brewing systems. I've brewed on both their 120 and 240 volt systems, and I'm telling you, these things are absolutely legit, efficient, easy to use with a relatively small footprint. You're not going to be disappointed with one of these units. Plus, the guys behind the company run a killer YouTube channel, one of my favorite, which you can find by searching YouTube for Clawhammer Supply. If you're in the market for electric brewing gear, make sure to check out everything Clawhammer Supply has to offer at clawhammersupply.com, and don't forget to let them know Brewlosophy sent you when you're checking out. That's clawhammersupply.com. Listener Alex wrote in with even more feedback on our prior discussion about brewing as art and or science. Alex said, science is the observation, identification, description, experimental investigation, and theoretical explanation of natural phenomena. Science does not have to be quantitative. Qualitative data is still science. In your podcast, you shared an example of a guy sampling barrels and then deciding subjectively when the barrels are done. This is still science, not only art. I hope this isn't coming off as pedantic. Something being a science something being a science should not be mutually exclusive with it allowing creativity. All scientific advances required creativity. I think a lot of what you were trying to discuss in the podcast is how there is still skill/craft/art involved in brewing, which is why sharing recipes doesn't even mean everyone can produce the same product. I think every science field still has a degree of skill/craft/art to it. A couple obvious examples are surgeons, chemists, and chefs. The underlying basis for all of these fields is undoubtedly science, but the skill of the individual has a large impact on the outcome. When I was in college to become a chemist, we all followed the same lab procedure, but the purity of the product depended on how precisely ingredients were measured and the ability to manage time and temperature. A lot of people talk about how baking is science, but cooking is not. I would argue both are science because of the underlying chemical reactions. It just so happens that with baking, people have accepted that weighing the ingredients gives a little more reproducible result, while for cooking, people have been more reluctant to weigh their ingredients. Sorry for how disorganized these thoughts are. I just thought I'd share my opinions on this subject.
Oh man, if I knew how popular that episode would have been, I know I've answered several questions about this, but keep them coming. These are awesome. And I love this perspective. I do agree that, some scientists have a gifting towards exploring different processes and different things. And just the way our brains work are all just a little different enough in how we troubleshoot and how we see the world. And so I think you're 100% correct. There is, even in the scientific processes that are around us, there are some people that just have a knack for making those processes work, and more so than others. And so I agree, and thank you for bringing this kind of more unique perspective to light.
Yeah, I think I've said it enough, my opinion on this enough at this point that most listeners can likely guess that I am with Alex on this one. Science and art are not mutually exclusive. And while certain people may naturally tend to focus more on one over the other, and I really do think it's just the focus, the science is there anyways. Making beer is science, period. You don't have to think about it for it to be science. I think there's always an element of creativity, art, and all of these things that we do. Like Alex said, even surgeons, there's an artistic component to it. That is the paint on the canvas. The canvas is the art, is kind of the way that I think I talked about it earlier. So yeah, clearly, Alex, there are folks out there who disagree, some who tend, based on the comments we've received at least, who seem to think that science can be mutually excluded from art. They are separate. They are completely different. And I just don't see it that way. I feel like art is the intention that we put behind the more objective science that's out there, the stuff that explains the cool things that we can do, like making beer. So thank you so much for hitting us up, Alex. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a line on social media. Hey, if you're not already subscribed to the Brewlosophy Show on YouTube, please go do that now at youtube.com/@thebrewlosophy show. That's the @ symbol followed by the Brewlosophy Show. No umlauts needed. Martin really is producing some seriously fun content over there, and judging by how rapidly we're gaining subscribers, I think we're already over 17,000 subscribers in less than a year. So that's pretty exciting. But we're pretty confident fans of this podcast are going to love it just as much as those people who have subscribed. So, all right, we're going to be back talking about adding honey in brewing right after this break. Chilling work can be a chore, especially after a long brew day, but not with the Exchillerator Counterflow Chiller, which can chill a 5-gallon or 19-liter batch of wort in 5 minutes or less, leading to a strong cold break and clear wort in the fermenter. Brewlosophy's Matt Del Fiacco uses the Exchillerator Max and absolutely loves it. In addition to improved chilling efficiency, every Exchillerator comes with a 5-year warranty that covers the entire chiller for manufacturer defects. If you're looking to up your chilling game and a CFC is right for you, head over to Exchillerator.com today. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. Commonly associated with Nut Cheerios, bunches of oats, I Shrunk the Kids, and of course, mead, honey is one of the most commonly used non-fermentables in beer. I've certainly consumed many beers that were made with honey, and I've even used it in my own brewing a handful of times over the years. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of when to add honey during the brew process, I think it'd be really interesting to spend a little time going over some basics of honey first. I know that in just the research for some of the experiments that we've done using honey, I learned quite a bit. First off, how is honey produced? I know everybody knows that honeybees make honey and there's honeycomb and all that, but I think there's some interesting details here. Female bees are the ones that start off by collecting the nectar from various types of flowers and plants. These are, I believe, these female bees tend to be a little bit older than the worker bees who stay at the hive and do the protecting and all of that stuff. Now, a really interesting note, and something that, again, I only recently learned when you were doing this article, Will, is that honey is not made from pollen. It is made from the nectar of plants, flowers, and such like that. The pollen sticks to the honeybees who are going out and collecting that nectar. And yes, they do use it to feed their young, to feed their larvae, but it is not what honey is made from. And that, as a kid, I always just thought the pollen is what they can somehow converted into honey. So it's nectar, which is a sugary sweet liquid that's secreted by the nectary glands of these various plants, largely flowers, of course, the sole purpose of which is to attract animals like butterflies, hummingbirds, and bees. And then the pollen that sticks to their legs or what other parts of their bodies, particularly for honeybees, while they're sucking up that nectar, it gets a free ride to these other plants, thereby pollinating those plants. So it's evolution in action, which I think is really neat.
That's super cool, and that's why we talk about saving the bees and all those things, because this pollination is just this kind of, like you said, happy accident, evolution in process.
Yeah,
where these bees are just like trying to get their meal for the day so they can get some nectar and go on living, and they still manage to go off and then help all these plants reproduce by spreading this pollen around.
Yeah,
and that's pretty amazing.
I think so too. And, you think about the millions of years that we've had, I mean, I say we, but these plants have had to evolve into these, or evolve these abilities, as it were. The pollen is what pollinates, obviously, but without these animals that are, I mean, I guess, there's pollination. I grew tomatoes one time and they were saying you can just go out and like tap the stalk of the tomato plant and that should be enough to pollinate the flower so that you get a fruit in the end. I just think it's fascinating that we've got these animals now that make it way more efficient, as it were, because they're bouncing around from, flower to flower, and then they're cross-pollinating and all that cool stuff. So anyways, there's other byproducts, of course, and that's what we're going to talk about now. So once these bees have collected their fill of nectar, their nectar sacs get full, they return to the hive and pass that nectar to younger workers, literally mouth to mouth. So they're giving it from themselves to this other worker bee, during which invertase enzyme, which we should be somewhat familiar with, is added to it. This invertase then converts the complex sugar, which is sucrose in the nectar, into these simpler sugars, glucose and fructose, which we've talked about quite a bit on this show.
Yeah, and that's cool. And then another thing that's really fun about nectar is that depending on where these bees are, because if you go to any farmer's market or whatever, you'll see, orange blossom honey. Some people have like wildflower honey,
right. Clover honey. Yeah.
Clover honey. All these things at your local's farmer market. I mean, even mesquite honey in Texas is kind of a thing, and all these things will affect the eventual product that we're getting ready to talk about in a little more detail.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of honey, is that it's not just basic. In fact, mead makers often talk about honey character, and there are certain mild honeys that don't have much flavor and are going to result in a much cleaner, not so characterful, perhaps not even as good of a mead. Whereas, other types of honey, I've heard buckwheat honey is really strong. You got to be kind of careful because it's such a pungent flavor. So things to keep in mind. But yeah, I find that fascinating too, that depending on what plants those bees are bouncing, to and from, that's going to determine the flavor of the honey, the pungency of the honey, all that kind of stuff. So after about 30 minutes of holding on to that nectar and allowing the invertase enzyme to do its thing, the moisture content of the nectar is reduced from around 70% to 20%, which is when it gets deposited into a honeycomb cell that we all know what that looks like. At this point, the bees flap their wings day and night to create this warm breeze that further dries and ripens the honey. If you've ever seen a live beehive, they're really, really cool. But these bees are just constantly flapping, and it creates this nice warm breeze, which again further reduces the moisture content of the honey now that is in those in the hive, and it makes it less susceptible to fermentation and spoilage by wild yeast and bacteria. So finally, the bees cap these cells with wax to preserve the honey. And then us humans go in and we harvest that honey for ourselves. One thing that you'll note on I think it's the National Honey Board and stuff like that is people, bee farmers or honey makers. I don't even know what they're called, but they are very conscious of making sure to leave enough honey for the bees themselves. And so we are taking the extra, essentially. We're taking what the bees don't necessarily require for their existence and their sustenance, and we're using that for ourselves. So I think that's pretty cool as well. But the whole process of making honey, and particularly the fact that it's not made from pollen, it's made specifically from the nectar, I think is really interesting. Now, if you go to a farmer's market, or if you go to somebody who produces honey and farms bees and all of that stuff, one thing that you'll see is raw honey sometimes does have little granules of pollen in it. And what they say about that, I'm not sure how this plays into fermentation, mead, beer, whatever, but what they'll say is that apparently that pollen can help people with allergies, and it has some other health benefits as well. But that is not a part of the honey making process. That's just an additive that's in there because it wasn't, filtered out or whatever
right.
It may be. So.
And sometimes you get little pieces of comb and stuff in there as well, which are kind of, if you like waxy things to chew on, they're kind of fun to chew on for a second and get the last little bits of honey. But that's just me. I think one thing to really key in on in that whole thing is we talked about the low moisture content and how between their enzymatic reactions and putting it in the comb as well as flapping their wings, because that low moisture content, that high sugar density is part of what makes honey such a great preservative. And then also the acidity of honey is a really great thing too, which also comes from some of those enzymatic reactions that happen there as well. And so that's why historically honey has been like one of the ultimate preservatives, and kind of this process really helps explain why that is so, especially with the low moisture, because for something to really spoil honey, it has to be the thing inside of the honey actually spoiled.
That's right. That's exactly right. So one other thing on that when I was a kid, I was told that honey is basically bee throw up. It's bee vomit. And that is not the case. Yes,
it's so tasty.
It's so tasty. I mean, I would eat it anyways. I was talking with my brother about this yesterday. I took my youngest daughter and my wife out just on a little lunch date to a hot pot place. And, they put some interesting stuff in their hot pot, but I love it. Tripe, whatever it might be, all these interesting meats. And my wife is like, I don't know how you do it, man. But I just, my mind doesn't go there. Even with honey, when I was a kid, I was like, oh, well, everyone's eating it. We're all still alive. So who cares where it comes from? It is not bee vomit. Yes, it does come from their sac, and it gets passed from their proboscis, their nose, basically, into another bee's, mouth, as it were, and then just for the enzymatic stuff. But it is perfectly healthy. You're not eating puke, and I think that's a good thing. So, all right, let's talk a little bit about some considerations on using honey when brewing beer. We know mead, and just to get it out of the way, mead is your typical mead is a 100% honey and water fermentation product, and so you can just put honey in a bucket, add some water, throw in some yeast, and you're going to make mead. It's probably not going to taste great if you don't do some other things to it, but that's mead. When it comes to using honey in beer, there are some things you just kind of have to keep in mind as you're planning your, designing your recipe and planning on using that honey. Let's go over some of that stuff.
So when you're brewing with honey, the points per pound per gallon is roughly 35. And to compare that to barley malt, you're normally going to get 38 ppg from barley malt. And so what that leads you with is about 1 pound of honey to a gallon of water result in a solution that's roughly a 1.035 starting gravity.
So that is important, right? So that when you're adding, 35 ppg for honey versus about 38 ppg for barley malt, they're fairly similar. So one thing some people will do is say, I'm going to take a pound of malt out and I'm going to replace it with honey so that my strength isn't too high. You're going to get right around the same OG in the end. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's not like you're making this huge swap for some something that's either way more, you're going to get way more specific gravity points out of it or way less specific gravity points. It really is about the same. And keep in mind, these are estimated numbers. There's going to be certain malts that get, 35 ppg. There's going to be malts that are a little hotter. You're going to get a few more points per pound per gallon. And that's all good. If you have your numbers, if you listen to the latest Brew Lab episode, you will learn that, how to read those spec sheets on malt. If you have those numbers, you can plug them into BrewFather or whatever it is, your recipe design calculator, and you can more accurately, design a recipe and predict that specific gravity in the end. But I feel like that is one of the most important considerations, is that yes, as fermentable as honey is, you can consistently predict that you're going to get right around that 35 ppg from it. So,
right, and these are whether it's barley or honey, these are like produced products by things that are not totally in our control, like bees and the weather. And so, again, like these numbers are good rules of thumb for the most part. But the fermentability of honey, again, is approximately 95%. So that means that 95% of that is fermentable sugars, whether it's glucose, fructose, but the things we mentioned earlier. But that residual 5% is where we're going to say that a lot of that flavor, aroma, and taste is going to come from, is that residual 5%. And so we want to try to keep those volatile compounds that are in there in the beer the best we can throughout this process.
That is certainly the argument, right? We know that certain compounds will volatilize off out of solution during the boil, or at even lower temperatures than the boil. You think about hops and all the talk around hop stands, because you're supposed to reduce the temperature of that wort before you add your whirlpool hops or your flame out hops, whatever you want to call those, so that you preserve these lower temperature volatiles that are in those hops, so that they're not getting blown off, and you have them aromatically and flavor wise in your beer. The same argument goes for honey, or at least it's been made for honey, that by adding the honey too early in the process, like say in the kettle during the boil, you're going to blow off some of the more volatile compounds in there that you want to be in the beer. You're using honey not just for additional strength. I mean, that's one easy way to do, one thing you're going to get from it, but that's a lot of money to spend on what you could just swap out with sugar if it's for the same reason, right? If you're not getting a flavor impact, you don't need to really spend all the money on honey. You can use something else. So many people do add honey during the boil. Again, their argument is, usually what I see first off is they toss it in the last like 5 minutes of the boil. Their argument being that they want to ensure any microbes that are in there, you are diluting that honey by adding it to the wort, that they are killed off so that they don't spoil the beer later on, right?
Right.
And so like we do with so many other things, you add it into the boil, not only does it get nicely incorporated and homogenized into the wort, so you don't have to worry about that or it falling out, but again, you're killing off any microbes that could potentially be there due to the dilution of that honey. Now, again, purportedly adding honey at the start of the boil, which I don't see many people doing anyways, is going to drive off the delicate honey and that's those flavors and aromatic compounds because of that long exposure to heat. But some people, again, contend that by throwing it in, just in the last 5 minutes, you're not driving all of them off, I think is the argument. Yeah. So, what are your thoughts on that?
So the conventional wisdom that I've read everywhere and have kind of subscribed to my life as far as kettle additions, we'll talk about fermenter additions here in a minute, is that the longer you boil, like you said, the more these go off. So 60 minutes, you're basically just adding sugar, and you can add table sugar, corn sugar, any number of other sugars way cheaper than a pound of honey.
Yeah.
So why would you do that? Why would you waste a delicate orange blossom honey, which smells so good, in a 60-minute boil? 30-minute additions purportedly add some light flavor, but as you said, most people, when they're adding it, or when I've added it in the past to the kettle, I'm going later in the boil, 15 minutes or later. Usually I'm going like 5 minutes left in the boil to flame out, just so that it kind of dissolves, gets really easily incorporated, and then there's a little bit of pasteurization time. Not that I personally worry about microbes, because as we said earlier, honey is a fantastic means of preservation. It's amazing. So usually microbes can't really live in it for very long successfully. So, but later in the boil, definitely will preserve a lot more of those flavor and aroma compounds from the honey. At least that's the conventional wisdom that I have prescribed to.
That is absolutely what I've heard as well. One thing to keep in mind, I absolutely can relate with and appreciate the fear of, adding potential spoilage microbes to your beer. I don't want to do that. I'm a nut about sanitation and all of that stuff. The thing is, most of the honey people are using for their beer has already been processed. I was fortunate enough, probably about 10 years ago now, I took my kids. There's a local bee farmer here in Clovis, California, about 10 minutes from my house, and I connected with him online. I found him through a honey board website. I think he was, at the time at least, he was the president of like the local bee farmers club or something like that, and he invited me and my kids over to check out his setup. It was really cool, and he explained to me what a beeline is and where that term came from. When you make a beeline for something, it's actually a real thing. Bees make it's a straight line from the hive to somewhere else, and they're constantly going back and forth. I think it's actually the flowers and stuff like that, but it's a straight beeline that they all stay in. It's really neat. So I got a lot. I learned a lot on that trip out to his place, and one of the things that I learned was that when they collect the honey, after they spin it out of the comb, which is a really cool process, it goes into like a vat, what we would call a kettle, and it's warmed. When it has to be warmed for it to flow nicely. And then there are certain filtration processes. And what he explained to me, because I was asking him about the antimicrobial thing, and he gave me some money to make some, not money, that would have been nice, but honey to make some mead with. And as he's giving it to me, and I'm asking him like, hey, do I need to warm this up first? And he goes, no. Not only is it antimicrobial, like even the fresh raw stuff that's not processed likely is not going to, contain live microbes that are going to spoil your mead or beer. But he goes, the heating process is going to kill all that stuff off anyways. That's actually what makes it clear. There's that and the filtration create this nice clear honey that we're all used to. Raw honey does not look like that. I'm sure most people have seen that. So I don't subscribe to the. I guess I'm not fearful of using honey at other points in the process, but when I've used it in the past, I'll admit I've always added it in the last 5 minutes of the boil because it's just easier, right? That's what I'm used to doing. Oh, there's the 5-minute, hop addition. Let me throw this honey in there now as well. It gets nicely incorporated. It's not real messy. I'm not trying to pour it down a little carboy hole, during fermentation. So that's always been the way that I've done it, and it's worked out. But like I think I told you this earlier before we started, Will. I never really tasted like a strong honey flavor in my beers, and I've always wondered maybe that's because either the amount I'm using just isn't enough, but I'm using the amounts that you see in common recipes, or I'm volatilizing off all of these more delicate compounds. Maybe if I added it during fermentation, as some people talk about, those would have been preserved. So how exactly does that work? Fermentation additions.
So for me, I have probably done more fermentation additions in the last several years. Like I started off doing it in the boil because especially when I was doing kits early on in brewing, and you saw like a honey amber kit, they would always say, well, add it at 30 minutes or 15 minutes. Kind of the spiel we just gave. But as you start diving into it and you want more of that honey character, the next logical step is to start throwing into the fermenter. And for me, I just kind of, you don't want to get it too hot because you're throwing it into your beer, but I like to warm it a little bit so it's a little more flowable out of whatever container it's in. Because one problem with, what's one cool thing about in the kettle edition is that I have a valve on my kettle, and so I can get most of the honey out, and then I can literally just pop the valve, put a little bit of hot wort in there, shake it, and then add the residual stuff that dissolved from me putting hot wort into a plastic bottle back into the kettle, and make sure I get all of that honey in there. But you don't quite have that effect during adding it to the fermenter, and you always have that kind of concern too in the fermenter, like how much of this stuff is just going to settle to the bottom. Hopefully that yeast will just kind of keep chewing and kick it back up into the rest of the wort, because when you're just dumping it in there, you're like, man, this stuff's so thick, it's just going to sink.
Yeah. Well, so I remember I had a friend who was making mead for a while. He was a brewer, but he was, dabbling in, like we all do, dabbling in mead making and all of that. And he said that he had heard from someone, I don't know who he heard this from, that you can take honey, pour it right into like a fermentation bucket or whatever you're fermenting in, but pour it right in there, add water on the top, pitch your yeast, and it will still ferment. Like it's not gonna, that honey is as dense as that honey is, the yeast are still gonna do their thing. And sure enough, he did it. So that was one of the things where I was like, well, I guess it doesn't need to be incorporated into the solution as well as, when I add it to the boil. That was my thinking. But I thought that was interesting. Anyways, before we move on, the last place where I've seen honey used is just for bottle carbonation, right? If you're bottle conditioning, similar idea as adding it during fermentation. The honey is used in place of dextrose or sucrose. And then given the absence of heat, some of that delicate honey flavor and aroma are believed to remain in the beer. So that's one way. My brother did that on a brown ale one time. He sent me bottles. I didn't taste the honey, but again, I never tasted these side by side. So brown ale, a little bit more assertive in terms of flavor for a beer. I do think that, blonde ale is kind of an ideal style for playing around with stuff like honey additions. And so just real quick, a quick BJCP description for American Blonde Ale. It's an easy drinking, approachable, malt-oriented American craft beer, often with interesting fruit, hop, or characteristic malt notes. Well balanced and clean. It's a refreshing pint without aggressive flavors. Kind of, again, perfect little backdrop for honey additions and other additions like that to see what the impact that those things have.
So I think honey can work in a lot of different styles. You do have to kind of adjust the amount. I think Brillosophy did an experiment in the past. I think Jake did it where it was like he used a Hellesbach and I did a similar recipe to his, and it turned out like super delicious and amazing. I think he was testing pasteurized versus unpasteurized honey additions in the fermenter on that one. But a blonde ale, definitely anything lighter in body is going to really, or lighter in flavor is going to probably accentuate that honey a little bit more. But I've had some honey porters and honey ambers that I think are really good. But for the purpose of experiments, for the purpose of really trying to highlight this ingredient, something like an American blonde ale does seem to be kind of the perfect kind of backdrop to what we're trying to accomplish here.
Absolutely, absolutely. So of the many beers that I've had that have been made with honey, most have been blonde ales. But like you said, I've had honey ambers. I actually had a honey stout one time. The stout was delicious, but not tasting them side by side, I've constantly find myself questioning, what part is the honey contributing anything that I'm perceiving besides strength, of course? Would it be different than a exactly same beer that doesn't have honey in it? I don't know. I don't know how these brewers were adding the honey. Maybe they were adding it to the kettle. Maybe I could see why commercial brewers might want to add it to the kettle because they need to sell this stuff, and a ruined batch is a lot of money down the drain. So, added precaution, I don't know. But you were curious to see what those differences are when you add it in the kettle versus adding it to the fermenter. And so you designed an experiment to test it out, Will. We're going to be getting into those results when we're back from this break. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com. And be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. When making a beer with honey, brewers have to decide at what point to add the sweet goodness. Do you toss it in during the boil, favoring pasteurization over flavor, arguably, or do you add it during fermentation to preserve those delicate characteristics at the risk of contamination? Or does it even matter? That's exactly what you aim to find out in a recent experiment, Will.
Right. So as we said, I wanted to find out if honey added during the boil versus in the fermenter made any impact on flavor differences. And this was something that going into, I had a really some strong opinions about, which we'll dive into later. But so essentially what I did is I took 2 5-gallon batches of a blonde ale that consists of 78% Tex malt, Wildfire pale malt, 7% Munich malt, and then it was about 1.5 pounds of honey, which ended up being about 15% fermentable into the batch.
That sounds like a nice base for a honey blonde ale to me. I mean, pale malt, a little bit of Munich, and then you're adding the honey, of course. Yeah, nice, basic, simple, a little bit malty, but nothing to get in the way of the impact of the honey, I would think.
Exactly, and that Munich had a nice little touch of backbone to it. But again, I don't think anything to get in the way of what honey was going to bring to the table. And so for the process, I mashed at 154 degrees Fahrenheit or 68 degrees Celsius for 60 minutes. When the mash was complete, I removed the grains and then boiled for 60 minutes. And then I added 14 grams of Northern Brewer at 60 minutes, and then just a tiny little bit of Amarillo, 14 grams at the 2-minute mark, just to add a little bit of something to it.
Yeah. Well, again, it looks like you use the Amarillo Lupo Max. That's a really incredible product that you just don't need to use as much as you would regular Amarillo to get the same effect. So right at 2 minutes, again, you're just trying to get to me, Amarillo has a nice citrusy characteristic that would work well. You know, you're not adding a ton of it, but that would work well with honey of many sorts, of course, but it sounds like you used orange blossom honey. So yeah, that to me works really well, too.
Well, the brand of honey I use, I think it was Kelly's. Like it's not specifically orange blossom, but they do blend it, and so there usually is a hint of orange blossom on the nose.
Okay.
Whenever you eat that honey, so not specific, but I did choose Kelly's. It's a local Texas brand, and there usually is like a hint of orange blossom on the nose of that honey. At least what I pick up. So,
nice.
So for the first batch, we introduced the variable. So honey was added to this batch with, I think it was about 5 minutes left in the boil. We added in the honey. So when the boils were complete, both worts were chilled and refractory reading was taken. And so the batch that had honey added was at 1.049, and then the one with no honey yet was at 1047. So obviously a little bit lower because, again, 15% of the fermentables hadn't been added into the batch yet.
Yeah, and again, considering the PPG, it was like adding 1.5 pounds more of malt. And so except you added honey that the other one didn't have. So we are, at this point, we're tracking, right? It's got higher OG, not by much. It was only 15% of the whole, grist fermentables, 1049 versus 1047. That sounds right about, accurate to me. So.
Yeah, pretty close. Close enough anyways for what we're doing here. So identical volumes of wort were transferred to separate fermentation kegs. I've got those beautiful keg miners there from Kegland. And once they were desired fermentation temperature of 66F or 19C, each was pitched with a pouch of Imperial Yeast A07 flagship.
Yeah, nice clean yeast. That's kind of what we're going for here. That's the what you would want in an American blonde ale. You want the yeast to get out of the way so that you taste a nice balanced malty, hoppy beer. And in this case, we want the honey to shine through. So using a nice clean yeast like Flagship is great. This is at the point now you let them ferment for a few days, but then you introduce the variable yet again to the other batch. This is the fermentation batch. How'd you do that?
So basically 3 days in, I kind of got the honey. I put it in a little bit of a warm spot just to kind of get a little bit more flowable, because one concern I always have with honey is like, how do you get every single drop of that goodness out of it?
Yeah.
So I did warm it a smidge just to make it a little more flowable. Not too much, not over 100 or anything. It was just a little bit warmer than room temperature. And then I poured that straight into the fermenter. My experience is kind of like what your friend described, where I've done several batches with honey in the fermenter and I just dump it in. I don't even think about it. I didn't pasteurize it. I didn't do any of those things. Again, honey is such a great preservative that any microbes that are in there are basically getting killed just because of the sheer density and acidity of honey. So that's not something I worry about personally.
Nah.
So beers will have to ferment for a couple more weeks before I took the final hydrometer reading. I just wanted to make sure this honey had fermented all the way out. I know people that are mead makers realize that yeast nutrient and all that nutrition is super important, and that if you don't do all that, honey can take a really long time. But I just want to give it enough time to ferment all the way out and let the yeast do their job. And so the honey in the boil ended at 1.006 final gravity, and the honey at fermentation ended at 1.005 final gravity. So off by about a point.
Yeah, which that's fine. That could be measurement error. That could be some other thing. We are brewing 2 batches side by side. There could be something amiss there. 1005 to 1006. That sounds about right to me. It could also be a function of the fermentation addition. We've all heard about feeding the fermentation, with other sugars, like when making Belgian ales and stuff like that. That if you feed it, you get a better attenuation. Maybe that's what it was. Who knows? But ostensibly, the wort comparison was 1049 to 1047. My hunch is that by adding that 1.5 pounds of honey during fermentation, you brought the OG effectively, you brought it up to where the boiled honey batch was at. So these are about the same in terms of strength overall. Nobody's going to taste a 1 SG point difference between these beers. So if there is a difference, in my opinion, it's going to be because of where this honey was added. So that's how we have to look at these things.
Yeah, and one point is within the limitations of instrument error anyway, so it's not something I'm going to lose sleep about at all. So at this point, the beers were cold crashed overnight before pressure transferred to CO2 purged kegs and placed in a kegerator. After a week of cold conditioning, the beers are carbonated and ready for evaluation.
Yes. Now, I believe one of our honey experiments in the past, I could be wrong on this, but it was done during COVID when we were doing our weird data collection stuff. This one, of course, was not. So you were able to serve it to real people, real human beings, participants as we call them. But before we get into that data, tell us a little bit about how you did on we always do, for all of these experiments, we do our own set of what we call semi-blind personal triangle tests. By semi-blind, all we're saying is, yes, we know the variable, but we're having these triangle tests served to us so that we don't, it would be stupid if we knew which beer was in which cup. So we don't, but we do know the variable. So we are cited to that piece of it. But we have them served to us by our wives, our kids, whoever might be, walking down the street at the time. How did you do on your set of triangle tests, Will?
So first off, when I saw them in the glasses and I poured them side by side, just for pictures and everything else, these beers looked identical with kind of a pale color and a nice white foam. But when I went to go do my own triangle tests, which normally I have my wonderful wife pour them for me, or I'll do some form of 4 cups with 2 marks on the 2 that are on 2 of them and no marks on the other ones, and just kind of shuffle them around and get to where I don't know what's what and do that 5 times is what we're supposed to be doing. But out of my personal triangle tests, I got the correct answer 3 out of 5 times, and pretty much those are just guesses. They were very much identical in almost every way. This floored me on my own personal test, because this really flew in the face of what I believed that fermentation additions were far superior to kettle additions, just because of the lack of heat being involved. But they both had a nice, kind of a subtle honey aroma. It wasn't like super in your face at 1.5 pound honey addition, but a nice little honey aroma came through. And then there was a subtle honey flavor there on the back end of both of them as well. But they were delicious, crushable honey blonde ales.
Yeah, there's this a psychologist in me can't help. It's part of what I love about what we do at Brewlosophy is that we are constantly questioning perception, right? When we adopt a approach, I'm going to keep this with just beer for now, but you can use it as an analog for other things in your life as well. When we take something on, we want that to be confirmed. We call it confirmation bias. And so if we know that I did this extra thing, or I did this new thing that's supposed to, based on what others, we call them appeal to authority, have said it should do, or whatever it might be, even if it's just belief, we tend to find those things, right? We tend to confirm our biases through our own observations. And it's, so if you're adding, you'd been brewing beers, you're adding them to the kettle, and then you learn that, by adding it to the fermentation process or during fermentation, I'm going to preserve more of those delicate flavors and aromas. And I start doing that. We tend to perceive that. Oh, good. That validates this change that I've made. It might add an extra step, but that's fine. It makes it worth it. And in this case, being unable to reliably distinguish them, yourself, Will, That is such, to me, it's a refreshing feeling. I like that. I know a lot of people hate that when they're proven wrong, that's something they've been putting so much effort into, regardless of what method in brewing it might be. But that's a lot of the pushback we get is, obviously your tasters are bad because I can tell a difference. Well, chances are you think you can tell a difference, and that's okay. That seems to be the case, at least in your experience here, Will. You saying that you were floored by the fact that you couldn't tell these beers apart. I mean, yeah, you got 3 out of 5 right, which sounds like a big deal because it's more than half. Remember, there's 3 beers, not 2. And we are naturally going to occasionally guess the right one more often than not. That happens. Those are called false positives. In this case, though, you admitted they tasted exactly the same. And I think that's fascinating as well, given the fact that you went from kettle additions to fermentation additions under the belief that it made a difference, right?
Oh, I had a very strong held belief about it. There was no doubt about that. So, refreshing. Maybe I was just floored, and it's great. I took it as great new data, at least on my for myself, especially since I couldn't tell the difference. But as you know, with these things, Marshall, we don't really care what I think. We got to go out and get other people to drink this stuff, right?
Amen to that. I couldn't care less what you think or how your performance is. Will, what I care about is the blind taster data. Tell us about that.
I've never felt so marginalized in my life. Thanks, Marshall. But the experiment results, there's 23 participants. So in order to get a significant experiment, we would expect to have 12 people check the right box. But we only got 7 people. Only 7 people were able to identify the odd beer out, which is about 40% of them. And so it is not significant.
Yeah.
So,
it's actually less than 40%. That's a typo in our show notes here. It's less than a third, in fact. When we're doing triangle tests, the expectation if all of the beers are identical is that 33.3% will select each cup. Now, obviously, because of randomization, that's just not how things always work out. But in this case, it was less than that. It was less than a third. And in order for us to reach significance, the way I explain it to people is more than enough people would have to select the odd beer out in order for us to say, okay, this selection of the odd beer out of this unique sample can be explained by something other than just random chance. There's something else going on here, and that's what we call a significant finding. It's pretty simple. In this case, tasters just couldn't tell a difference whatsoever between the beer where the honey was added in the last 5 minutes of the boil and the one where it was added during fermentation. And again, having made a few honey beers in my day, I'd say probably no more than 10, no fewer than 5. So somewhere in between there, I've added it to the kettle. Again, I couldn't really taste the honey part of it. I knew that it had some impact. I'm just curious now because of these results. Now, we are not saying that with certainty, if you add it to the fermentation, you're going to get the same characteristic if you add it to the boil. We are saying that in this specific experiment, it seems to suggest that the point of addition didn't have a perceptible impact, didn't have a noticeable effect. And I think that's fascinating. What it makes me wonder is, okay, if you take that blonde ale and you use all malt and then you add honey to the fermentation, are we going to taste a difference there? Because maybe all of that goodness is fermenting out and it's volatilizing off during the fermentation process as well. I really don't know, but I think it's an interesting finding.
Yeah, that was kind of my thought on it is, maybe it is that the fermentation, the act of yeast kind of turning and churning this stuff over is enough to volatilize off those flavor compounds. Maybe if I would have, gone up to a 30% honey addition versus a 15%, maybe if we doubled the quantity, maybe we would have had a different result. That seems like something worth exploring to me. Maybe if I would have gone with like a more pungent honey, because there are some honeys out there that are a little bit more pungent, mesquite honey kind of comes to mind. Maybe if I had gone with something with a little more kind of oomph to it, or maybe something with, if I would have gone pure orange blossom honey to get those more pure aromatics in there, maybe that could have contributed something. But, all those seem like topics that are definitely worth exploring more to me and just piqued my curiosity. Yeah,
everything that you noted are the notes that I have as well on what I would like to see in the future. When we find a non-significant result like this, yes, it happens often, but we try to come up with some potential explanations for, okay, what was it then? Because we've got these well-established ideas, right? If you add honey during fermentation, it's going to preserve these aromas and flavors. Great. Except we weren't able to show that. So what could it possibly be? I do think, 15% honey is a very common thing that you're going to see in honey beer recipes. Yes, you can use more, but if the more you add, the more, the way I want to put it is this: the more malt that you replace with honey, the more you push more into the mead area and pull away from beer. And we're making a honey beer. And so I think that's an important thing. I'm not sure I've ever seen a recipe over about 25% honey in it. If you have one out there, I'd be fascinated to see it and taste it. You can send me some, because then maybe I would actually taste the honey. But most of the ones I see are 10 to 15%. And so I would have expected for this, if point of addition has an impact, I would have expected for us to be able to see that here in this experiment, and we didn't. Like you said, another thing that I'm fascinated by is the pungency of the honey based on the type of flower that the bees are getting that nectar from. I think there's just massive amounts of experiments we could do comparing different types of honey and seeing if that has an impact. But again, I think the first thing we need to establish, and this experiment is what really got me thinking about it, is, do honey additions have a noticeable impact? And again, we're not taking these to Cicerone, BJCP Grandmaster judges. These are the regular beer drinker who tend to feel like, when you see honey blonde ale, that is arguably a marketing thing. There's honey in it. Ooh, I want honey flavor, Does it have that impact? Is it actually creating this flavor? Or could brewers save a little bit of cash by just not using the honey and maybe tossing in some honey malt or something? I don't know, but I think it's an interesting line of research that we have, open to us now because of these results. If I'm making a honey beer in the future, I'm probably going to keep adding it to the boil based on these results, in part because it means I don't have to take the cap off of my fermentation vessel and potentially risk oxidation, which to me does have a noticeable impact. We've shown that over and over, and I absolutely hate it. So anything I can do to avoid exposing my fermented beer to oxygen, I'm going to do. And hence, my honey beers in the future are going to be made by doing late kettle additions. That's until we can show something else that fermentation additions do have a positive impact. I'm sticking with boil additions. How about you?
So the one thing I'm curious about, because I did make, I think it was Jake who did the honey Hellesbach during COVID, and I did copy that recipe more or less, and he used, it was still only 50% of the fermentables, but it's like 2.25 pounds of honey in that recipe, and and he put those in the fermenter, and that almost did taste like a mead with like 2.25 pounds from what I remember with that really light bodied honey Hellesbach. So I am curious, maybe if we up the percentages, up it's 2 pounds even. But I think as far as what I'm going to do in the future, I do think there is something with you're adding these additional sugar additions, and while like a blonde ale is only like a 1050 beer or whatever, so it's not a big deal, but there is something to be said for adding some of these additional fermentables into the fermenter, just because your yeast have had some time to kind of build up and get a little bit more of a yeast starter, if you will, and a lighter gravity beer before you add in honey, which is something kind of hard for yeast to chew through. Maybe it'll just depend on what blows my hair back that day or what I have time to do, but it's good to know that I can do either or, and so far based off of this, it's not really going to make much of a difference.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly the point is, if you're making a honey beer, I think the bigger concern is that it's having some impact other than adding strength, of course. And so that like I said before, I want to establish that now. I'm so curious to see if swapping out some malt with honey, if people will be able to perceive a difference in those beers. So that's for further grist for the mill, as it were. So, well, that is all the time we've got for this episode. Do you have any final words before we wrap things up, Will?
No, I think honey is just a great ingredient to add. Now, whether or not how much impact it has, we're still up in the air, but I think there's so much more interesting and fun things to explore with this ingredient. And it's just such a fun ingredient anyways, because of who makes it and how we get it, and all the implications of where it's harvested as well.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Well, don't forget to check out the Brew Lab podcast, where Brewlosophy's Cade Job takes you into the lab with brewing experts to discuss the fascinating work they're doing on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed in this episode by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go